So we're very fortunate today to have Lee Shaker be joining us from Portland State. And he's going to be talking to us about parallel crime. So with that, give the floor to you, Lee.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to come up here. I enjoyed having an excuse to not proctor a midterm today, although I think there aren't many students in the room. So don't take too much offense, but I will say after even, I guess about 4 years now, I still have like an almost indescribable joy when I realize that I'm giving the test, not taking the test. So just by virtue of it being like a midterm day, I'm in a great mood, and it's great to be here too. Thanks again for inviting me up. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the beginnings of a research project that I started, I guess, last summer, and I'm continuing this year and for at least the next 16 months. And I'm interested to hear what you think. So go ahead and begin. So the research I'm conducting is done in collaboration with an organization named Peripheral Vision International, and PVI is an NGO that operates primarily in Uganda, a little bit more broadly in East Africa, which focuses on media and public diplomacy work. Their work basically has two components. The first part is creation, media creation. So on this one hand, they create messages that are designed to espouse and support various progressive causes. So things like women's rights, disability awareness, diversity and tolerance issues, some health campaigns, pro-democracy, and so on. They do this on their own, but also in partnership with different NGOs and local community organizations as well. This is a still from one of their messages that was done together with Marie Stopes, which is an international NGO that primarily focuses on sexual health and reproductive issues. This was a campaign for Marie Stopes Uganda that was designed to promote the creation of a toll-free hotline that people from outside of Kampala, this capital city in Uganda, could call to receive information about basically sexual activity, sexual practices. So what you see here is a still from it. The woman is a Ugandan pop star named Sheba. She last summer had maybe the most successful song of the year in Uganda, which was called Ice Cream. And you see actually two little girls as puppets who are having a conversation about relationships when Sheba strides in and sets them straight about the need to call somebody who knows a little bit more about sex than they do at their age. They're holding ice cream cones, and just after this, they get excited when they realize it's Sheba, and they fling their ice cream across the screen. The other part of PVI's work is to figure out ways to distribute these messages in places like Uganda. 90% of households in Uganda don't have electricity, so getting an audio-video message throughout the country in front of the population is actually a challenge. What this often means is that even though people don't have a television at home or their own internet connection, they do have some kind of access to mass media in public places through simple feature phones and in gatherings in sort of pseudo-public settings, in bars, in salons, in places that are called vibanda, which are very rudimentary video halls, often just having like a 20-inch CRT television in a dark room. PVI tries to figure out ways to get their content into the hands of people that are displaying media throughout the country. And so one thing they do, for example, is called crowd pullers. Crowd pullers is basically their own very basic version of MTV, or at least MTV when it actually played music. And what it is basically is hour-long episodes of music videos that are interspersed with messaging, maybe PSAs like this, maybe news content, maybe PSAs that were created by another organization that are trying to reach the Ugandan public, then distributed on VCD. So not a technology that people in the US ever really use, but basically a CD that's burned with a video file and then physically distributed across the country on a weekly basis. They actually have a database of something like 5,000 ambient screens in the country now, and 8 full-time employees that work just on distributing these discs and staying in touch with video hall and salon owners across the country, and also in close contact with the sort of the nation's video pirates who supply most of the content to these screens around the country. So the program I'm here to talk about today, or the initiative, actually kind of brings both creation and distribution together, and it's called Newsbeat. Newsbeat is a weekly rap news program that is 5 minutes long, recorded both in English and in Luganda, Luganda being the primary local language of Kampala, but actually only spoken by about 25% of the Ugandan population at large. This program is actually carried on national television, broadcast channel, which is also on the satellite distributors in Uganda, and then also it's included in the episodes of crowd pullers that are created on a weekly basis and sent out to the country. So if you want to think about it in like a very rough analogy, it's kind of like the Kurt Loder to crowd pullers, Kurt Loder to MTV, again, back in the past when MTV had videos and news and not just reality programming. So, last little point about Newsbeat. The idea of Newsbeat, its mission is basically to educate and edify a burgeoning generation of Ugandans who may otherwise not be consuming any kind of news. And I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. Anyway, my job basically is to work with PVI to add a third element to their portfolio. So if they have media creation and media distribution, my job is basically to bring research into the equation so that they have basically a research process that's integrated with the creation and the distribution of the messages so that they basically are doing a better job creating messages that have the effects that they want to have and then measuring and evaluating the effects that they do have. This presentation is, of course, really about research. So we're going to talk about the first steps of research on this program, which specifically is an experiment designed to evaluate a priming effect that they were trying to create with content from Newsbeat. But before I get to that, I'm going to talk just a little bit about Uganda, so you have some kind of basic background knowledge about the country, and then cover a little bit of literature and research before getting into the actual experiment method and findings. So, Uganda. I'd never been to Uganda before last summer, so I still am learning about the country, but what I can say is that at least on first blush, the country has a lot of things going for it. So here you go, this is kind of a close-up of the country, and this little red dot shows you where it is on the continent of Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, your first thought might be it's probably pretty hot there. Uganda actually isn't that hot. It's about 7,000 feet elevation across the country, which means that year-round it's about 27 degrees centigrade, 80 degrees. It's surrounded by these great lakes, so it has a very optimal temperature, has a lot of sunshine at the equator, it has ample and abundant fresh water, and it has fertile soil. So at just a basic level, like this stretch of the planet is really a good place to be, right? You're really going to have a hard time starving in a place where you can so easily grow food. And I will say that as a North American person, I was shocked to see people just driving over avocados. Avocados fall down from the sky, land in the street, and they're a nuisance. I think but that would make such good guacamole. The country, of course, has these natural advantages. It has some disadvantages. You look at it, and one thing you can immediately see is that it's landlocked. And if you are there for a little bit, you also learn that it doesn't have reliable rail service, and so in many ways it's kind of functionally cut off from the world, or at least the world economy. Has a hard time getting its goods out of the country and really getting people across the country too. The median age right now in Uganda is 15.5. It is the youngest country in the world, so very rapidly growing and straining the infrastructure and the resources that do exist there. Newsbeat is specifically designed to be accessible to this young audience, right? figuring folks that are 13 years old, not likely to tune into sort of a traditional talking heads newscast, trying to reach them where they are, create content that resonates with them, while at the same time still delivering some kind of meaningful content and hopefully something that instills some progressive values at the same time. The country is run by a dictator, this man here on your right. His name is Yoweri Museveni. He took power in 1986 through military intervention. What can I say about him? He isn't as bad as Idi Amin, who was one of his predecessors in Uganda and a famous butcher. But he's not great either. He benefits in some ways by comparison to the people that came before him, but they are so long ago now that the advantages of not killing your own people are starting to, I guess, seem a little thin to the population there. He made international headlines in the last year to 2 years by signing a strident piece of legislation that penalized homosexuality with life in prison, and doing so in part to deliberately flout the sort of will or the desires of Western powers and Western individuals who fought against this bill. In short, he's repressive. He's viewed by many at this point as an impediment to progress in Uganda. He's blocked open elections, he quashes free speech, and he's clearly involved right now in trying to glide the path for his son to take over for him in the near future. This little bit of corruption is representative of a larger problem in Uganda. There are many specific problems in the country relating to economic development, poverty, health. All of these problems are exacerbated by pervasive corruption. Couple quotes here for you. Like this first one is from a report from Human Rights Watch and Yale Law School that came out 2 years ago now. Corruption in Uganda is severe, well-known, and a source of suffering for average citizens. In order to address basic problems of poverty, of public health, of environmental degradation, basically you're first going to have to address corruption. This makes corruption an issue that a program like Newsbeat needs to cover, but it's not so easy to cover something critically when the government doesn't want you to talk about it. The second quote speaks to this point a little bit. According to Freedom House, Uganda's media environment is marked by, quote, intimidation and harassment from state and non-state actors that stifles free speech. So, super fast, that kind of gives you a little bit of a sense of what's going on in Uganda. At one level, it's a place that has great potential, sort of a blessed slice of our planet, but at the same time, it's potential that's being held back, perhaps by a government that is entrenched and not necessarily responsive to the public. So, sort of step back for a second here. If you stop and think about it, a program like Newsbeat is basically a non-traditional form of public diplomacy. And historically, if you think back towards like the 20th century and the Cold War, if you thought about public diplomacy, really what you were thinking about was tactics employed by one government to influence the people of another country and hopefully then in turn influence their government. Newsbeat is sponsored by PVI, but PVI does not receive any funding from a government. Still, the messages that it's espousing, sort of these resonant progressive Western values, specifically relating in part to transparency and democracy and good governance, resonate with the values of American public diplomacy. As such, PVI and Newsbeat are basically part of a rising tide of NGO-driven public diplomacy around the world. Modern media technologies basically give the opportunity to allow people who want to have a voice to seize that opportunity and have a voice. This is a sort of an opportunity that's available in many ways to everybody, right? Even terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but also including an organization like PVI. Today, if you believe in something, you can put that position out there and put it in front of the world if you take the time to create the message and get it out, distribute it, and try and disseminate it. This foment, right, this means that there's like kind of counter messaging, messaging from the left, messaging from the right, messaging domestically, messaging internationally, is actually, I think, really interesting. And that's, in a way, what this project is really about, trying to understand the implications of kind of this fragmentation of diplomacy. I think it's really interesting, but of course, I'm a media scholar, so I have maybe a little bit of a biased view there. Anyways, there's like a burgeoning literature on maybe what's called new public diplomacy that sketches the outlines of this phenomenon. And in fact, it's a literature that Matt has contributed to. But so far, there's not a lot of empirical work that explores this. There's some, and kind of highlighting a little bit of it here that I'm not going to get too far into because I have a limited amount of time here. But I do want to give you a couple quotes from a key piece by Gilboa, which I think is probably still maybe the best recent synopsis of the available literature, although it's getting a little dated now, 5 or 6 years old. Anyway, the first quote I want to talk to you here, I'll tell you. Quote, almost every study of public diplomacy mentions NGOs, but very few studies examine how they work, whether they adopt a political agenda, and how they affect policies of other actors. Like I said, there's a few studies that do this now, but still relatively small number. The second quote relates to the state of the body of this literature, which Bob Entman generously said completely lacks a theoretical infrastructure, direct quote. Gilboa echoes this general sentiment, and then he adds, quote, the communication literature is rich in theories and models of media effects such as agenda setting, framing, and priming, but public diplomacy scholars and practitioners rarely employ them, and very few studies have integrated media effects with public diplomacy concepts. So if you kind of take these two quotes together, the argument is something like this. The extant scholarship on public diplomacy lacks empirical work about NGO-led public diplomacy and is short on the integration or application of theory, especially media effects theory, into this work. These two things to me sound like an opportunity. So there are basically kind of two things going on here that I'm trying to bring together for you. The first thing, PBI has this mission. And the mission is basically that they want to use Newsbeat to empower Ugandans, to instill norms and expectations of democracy, of competent, honest, transparent government, that they can have this, that they should have this, that it's something that maybe they can demand and receive. But while trying to fulfill that mission of instilling that belief in the audience, it isn't possible for Newsbeat to directly criticize Museveni or his regime. Doing so may result in Newsbeat being taken off the air, or perhaps actually even worse consequences for the staff of Newsbeat back in Kampala. The second part here is that there's a research opportunity. There's clearly lots of room in this developing public diplomacy literature for applied empirical work. First, or more broadly, what does this NGO-led public diplomacy look like, and how does it differ from traditional forms of public diplomacy? Are there conflicts between it and government's positions? How are these sorted out, and so on? I think actually maybe you've dealt with some of that. Specifically thinking about this project, can we use media effects theory to shape the intervention that we're doing with Newsbeat? What are the effects of Newsbeat? How do media effects that have been observed in the United States map onto a foreign context? At the same time then, is there a way to kill these two birds with one stone? We think so. We think that basically the stone that we wanted to investigate here to address both of these challenges is basically priming theory. So, priming. Assume you basically have heard of it before. Priming, the activation of an idea in a person's mind, readying that idea for use in later activities, such as making a judgment or reacting to someone else's action. Quickly move past priming a little bit here. Think about priming, we usually think about some of the foundational studies that used it, Iyengar and Kinder, from the 1980s. This is a nice still of a great moment in American history, American-Russian history, right? Gorbachev and Reagan meeting in Geneva, I think. Iyengar and Kinder's idea, which they tested in the context of Ronald Reagan and his presidency, was basically that the overall evaluation of President Reagan could be affected by the specific weighting of different issues, which then changes on the basis of which news stories their people see before making a judgment. So specifically, right, they manipulated the content of news stories about Reagan and the United States before experimental subjects saw a survey where they made an evaluation about Reagan. If they saw a story about national defense, the logic is then that they would weight thoughts of national defense higher or more heavily when they made their overall evaluation of Ronald Reagan. Our idea is a little bit different. Newsbeat can't cover corruption in Uganda. So we can't say, hey, there's this one aspect of Museveni that you need to know more about or that you need to think about when you make your overall judgment, which is basically what Iyengar and Kinder were doing. What we could do is cover corruption in other places outside of Uganda. So our question really here is, might there be a parallel process in which the topic, corruption, like generally speaking, is the priming element rather than the subject or the person that's being covered. So will the topic, corruption broadly, activate concern about corruption in Uganda specifically? Can we parallel prime a concern or salience for corruption? If the answer is yes, if we can use international news to shape domestic evaluations, then the idea is that Newsbeat can effectively challenge domestic Ugandan corruption with a strategy that is much less likely to be detected or censored or punished by Ugandan local officials. So, probably ready to watch some rap news at this point. With this sort of general premise of parallel priming in mind, Newsbeat made a point to cover instances of corruption around the world from the program's inception in February 2014 through its first season, which ended in August, I think, of 2014. So I'm going to play a quick video for you that shows you two examples of these stories. It's actually not the stimuli that were used, or that was used in the experiment, because I'm going to show it to you in English, and in the experiment we used the Lugandan version, which would be less useful here today. You'll notice that the stories are actually drawn from two different episodes and then simply edited together by me, so there's a little black sort of screen in between. The actual experimental stimulus was done more professionally, so it doesn't have that same kind of gap. It flows seamlessly. Yeah, so let's go ahead and see what Newsbeat looks like. Try and get the volume right here to start. It might be loud.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. This is the Newsbeat presented to you by Ladies Black and MC Lloyd. Follow the beat from the city to the street. Info with the flow, keep you sharp and in the know. Sit back, relax, enjoy the news, follow. South African president's lifestyle is being questioned after he spent $23 million on a fancy mansion. The bill, of course, is for the hard-working taxpayers who wonder if Mr. Zuma will return the palace later.
Even in the times of appetite, when black Africans were left on the side, accommodation for prime ministers, the Clark and Botha never exceeded more than $20,000.
But when Nelson Mandela walked out free, his home was bid for $1 million fee.
Some will say I will deserve compensation, but what did Zuma do to get his pricey mansion?
There is no money for hospitals and schools, yet there's plenty of cash for presidential swimming on the rise.
And the whole continent can't disguise.
That's why our leaders keep begging for aid. It's always the same people devouring the cake. Brazil is no longer a developing country. They've managed to bring 40 million people out of poverty. With good leadership, this former Portuguese colony has surpassed the UK as the world's 6th largest economy.
Hosting the World Cup and the Olympics is quite the big chance for the soccer-loving nation to improve on infrastructure and transportation.
The World Cup is coming and Brazil is under pressure, and this is not for the quality of its soccer, but over the readiness to host this tournament.
They've exceedingly spent over $11 billion.
A number of stadiums are still incomplete and the event organizers are under the heat.
9 people have died on construction sites. Unfortunately, corruption is on the rise.
More than 1 million people took to the street protesting against violence from the police.
They've marched against wasteful expenditure and lack of investment in health, education and infrastructure.
In the last tournament, Brazil beat Spain 3-0 while police were firing tear gas at the people outside the stadium. The picture was not good.
Winning the World Cup might bring back the positive mood.
But in case of a poor Brazil performance, the party would turn into bloody violence.
No need to panic. The show must go on.
And with the mighty Brazil playing at home, it will be hard for these skillful soccer players to be outplayed and kicked off their throne.
Germany and Spain are still among the favorites, but with the record 5 World Cup victories, Brazil remains the firm favorite to take the trophy.
That was the news on the beat. Next week will be another hit, Still Let It Slide.
And Survivor.
Reporting live and direct with love and respect. Follow the beat, follow the beat, follow the beat, follow the beat.
Follow the beat.
Follow the beat, follow the beat, follow the beat, follow the beat.
Follow the beat.
Okay, so there are just a couple things about those stories that I wanted to point out before we move on. The first is that I wanted to point out sort of the grand scale of the corruption that they're talking about here. You know, a mansion that costs tens of millions of dollars, graft in the pursuit of a World Cup where they've spent billions of dollars and neglected infrastructure and other more basic needs of the Brazilian people. Talking about big things here, things that don't necessarily have a parallel in Uganda. Certainly, they don't have the stadiums to host a World Cup anywhere near Uganda right now. The second thing is that neither story mentions any kind of punishment or recrimination for these acts of corruption. There are no negative ramifications that are specified, and in fact, even in the story about Brazil, you see that the protesters were shot at by police. So the kind of frame or the context for the corruption is worth noting here. I guess watching the video again, they do mention like the possibility of a Brazil loss in the World Cup. I don't know, but they ended up losing, was it like 11-0 in the semifinal game? So maybe if you're Brazilian, you'd think that that was some kind of negative ramification, that like God was smiting the Brazilians with an 11-0 defeat. But really, no true punishment shown here. All right, so let's talk about an experiment for a little bit. To see if this attempt at parallel priming had any effect, we conducted a pretty simple 2x2 experiment it's kind of like a pilot project. We're trying to get our methodological bearings in Kampala and Uganda some, while also then testing the specific content of these stories. So some basics about the design. It's a 2x2 experiment. The video condition is treatment and control, which I'll explain more in a second. The second factor is whether the videos were seen in a group setting in Video Hall Bibanda, or whether they're watched by individuals on small Android tablets. There are about 500 participants that went through this project. A bit more than half watched in a group, the rest watched as individuals. Randomly assigned people to the treatment and control condition. Both video programs are about 13 minutes long. We put them sandwiched in between 2 music videos, same video. One was actually the Sheba song that I mentioned before. Another was by a guy named Eddie Kenzo. So music video, Newsbeat episode, music video, which is kind of designed to capture the way that people are most likely to see the program when it's distributed on Crowd Puller's discs. but also to give people a chance to acclimate to the viewing conditions, the tablet, the video hall, before then the actual experimental content starts. The treatment had 4 different corruption stories edited together into a single episode. They actually used a DJ scratch to seamlessly beat match between segments from different shows. The overall episode length was similar to a normal episode of Newsbeat. The control condition had 4 stories that were non-governmental. So one of them was about 3D printing. One was about a white man who walked the length of the Nile River. One was about the Donald Sterling NBA race controversy that happened here in the US last year. The video stimuli was all in Uganda, like I said before. The survey after watching the video, there was a survey after the subjects watched the video. The subjects were given a choice. They could either take the survey in English or in Luganda, based on whichever they were more comfortable with. Survey is pretty simple. It's just 2 pages, front and back of one sheet of paper, designed specifically to be accessible or manageable for people who are not in the habit of doing a lot of reading or writing or doing, Western-style research. And there are really just 4 key dependent variables drawn directly from Iyengar and Kinder's work on the survey. So you see here 3 questions that asked subjects to give an evaluation of President Museveni and his party's performance on different issues, the economy, education, and corruption, followed then by an overall feeling thermometer about President Museveni's general job performance. So 0 being low, 100 being high. Please rate the president. Couple hypotheses here. First one is basically just that people who are exposed to corruption stories, the people in the treatment condition, will then subsequently weight corruption more heavily in their overall evaluation of President Museveni. So this is just the sort of straightforward, this is the priming effect. Rather than specifying a second hypothesis, we had a research question here. And without getting too much into the background, the research question is kind of inspired by mixed findings that other researchers have had doing similar research. Which direction basically will the video influence the viewers? Will exposure to Newsbeat coverage of international corruption events produce an assimilation or contrast effect? Will people who see the corruption around the world rate Museveni more favorably or less favorably in terms of corruption? 2 clarifications about the data before we look at the results here. In the analysis, only respondents who reported that they understood the video stimuli well or very well were included. The rationale is this. We showed the experiment, we did the experiment in Kampala. Kampala is the capital city in Uganda. People from all around the country are migrating there. The primary local language is Luganda. So even though people speak English, Luganda is their daily language. That's what they're most comfortable with. However, like I said, 25% of the people in the country speak that language. Migrants to Kampala may not speak Luganda. So we didn't try and filter out people from participating in the survey on the basis of whether or not they were actually from Kampala or not, because it's very difficult. There's an incentive involved. People are inclined to do what they need to do to get that incentive. We let everybody watch the video, and then we just asked them if they understood it or not. And if they didn't understand it, then it's not reasonable to expect that there would be any effect of it. So we excluded people who said they did not understand the experimental stimuli. This reduces the overall N to about 370. In addition, I mentioned before that it was a 2x2 experiment. The second dimension of the experiment, the second factor was group versus individual. For power reasons, we combined group and individual into one analysis here. There are no significant differences on the 4 dependent variables across the group and individual conditions. And so it made sense to just try and use them together. All right, so some quick results here. Figure 1, this is just the comparison of people in the treatment and condition treatment and control conditions, evaluations of Museveni on the 3 different policy areas that I mentioned before. And what you see is that across all 3 conditions, folks in the treatment condition gave slightly more favorable evaluations to Museveni. So from actually, it's a scale of 1 to 4 favorability. Slightly higher in economy, slightly higher in education, higher in corruption. Across the 3 issues, the only one that is significantly different is corruption, less than PO5. So, simple indication here is that the manipulation did something. You might notice already, however, something is slightly awry. Second figure here. So this is a figure that's drawn from regression analyses, and this is the sort of true test of whether or not there's a priming effect. What you see here is the coefficient from a regression that controlled for age, education, and gender, the coefficient for the evaluation on corruption as a predictor for an overall evaluation of Museveni and his job performance. In the control condition, the coefficient is just a little bit over 5, and it's non-significant. In the treatment condition, the coefficient increases to about 9.5, and it's significant p less than 0.001. So the basic story here is that when viewers were primed, corruption was a significant component of their evaluation of Museveni. This was not the case for viewers who were not primed. But when you step back and think about these results for a second, there's a problem here. We succeeded in making corruption more salient, but we also increased favorability towards Museveni's performance on corruption. So in the language of the research question, this is a contrast effect. In the language, like more broadly, this is a boomerang effect, right? We had the opposite of the intended effect, or an iatrogenic effect. So what happened here? The sort of simple idea that we have here is that the quote-unquote newsworthy examples of corruption that we showed an audience in Uganda basically made the corruption that they were familiar with seem pedestrian by comparison, right? When we primed corruption, it activated their experiences with corruption in their own lives. Corruption that they experience probably is closer to somebody taking a small amount of money or giving a favor to a cousin or a relative. It's not building a $40 million mansion or stealing whoever knows how much in the process of producing the Olympics or the World Cup. Folks in our treatment condition, we think, basically saw this and thought to themselves, well, yeah, it could be worse. And that's not exactly the process that we want them to proceed through. Also, in the control condition, when you see the evaluations of corruption, on a 4-point scale, you're looking at a rating that was something like 1.5. It's a lot easier for that rating to go up towards 4 than it is to go down towards 1, right? There's a floor effect here. It's hard to do anything that's going to make people think less of Museveni when it comes to corruption. And so perhaps inadvertently, we did something that drove them in the other direction. There are lots of limitations here. This is just the beginning, really, of ongoing research that we hope will continue at least for another 18 months and possibly longer than that. But I'll mention a couple of limitations here, try and flag some of the big ones that you may already be thinking about. One of the immediate ones relates to the difference between these two coefficients. Though corruption is a salient predictor, a significant predictor in the treatment condition and not in the control condition, the difference across the two is technically, well, it's not technically, it is not significant itself. So kind of interpreting this, what this means is that we think we saw an effect. It's enough of an effect for us to be concerned about producing these stories in the same way going forward, but it's not a huge effect, and we don't have absolute certitude about this. Another issue that we encountered was that there's some uncomfort or discomfort with the research process. The participants felt wary about answering questions about politics, especially in a public setting where there were sometimes white people in the room. This is not circumstance that was common for them. It's an authoritarian regime. Bad things happen to people sometimes in a place like Uganda. So this prompts some concern about the validity of our findings. You know, what really drove the more positive estimations of Museveni after the treatment? Was it that they really felt like corruption wasn't so bad, or was it that they were just a little bit more concerned about being honest? What I will say here is that we had folks in groups and in individual settings, right? In the group setting, there's a little bit of social pressure, there's a little bit of concern that people might be seeing you, that there's perhaps an outsider in the room. The individual setting, individuals were just watching on a tablet, answering on their own. The local enumerators were not hovering. There actually was no difference across the two group and individual conditions on these dependent variables. So it's a little bit of indication that what we saw is actually attributable to the treatment, not just the circumstances. Anyway, looking forward, there's lots of threads to pull for continuing research. We'd like to work on ways to improve our external validity, thinking about the circumstances, making the circumstances more comfortable for people, maybe asking questions that allow them to speak more in the third person, less in the first person, different ways to make the process a little more responsive to their needs. We'd like to do something that tested the duration of effects. This was just a simple, right? You watch the video, you answer the survey. It's immediate. Obviously, when you look at the literature, duration is an important factor. Along with that, we'd like to do something that was truly more reflective of the viewing experience, right? This is something that airs over the air. It's a perfect opportunity to do a more typical field experiment, which would address some of the external validity concerns, as well as then giving us a better sense of the true effect and duration of effects and so on. That being said, really the most important thing that we're concerned with is controlling the actual effects of the prime, trying to get away from that boomerang that we had. So with that in mind, season 2 of Newsbeat is already on the air. And with the lessons learned from this experiment so far, we've already altered our approach to covering corruption on Newsbeat. So, like I said, we don't have, home run evidence here, but we felt that the evidence from this experiment was strong enough or encouraging enough to tell us that we could expect to have a priming effect on the audience. But we actually want to prime the audience in the direction that we'd like to see. So we're trying a few different tactics of covering corruption, covering positive exemplars, doing some different things to try and find the right formula for leading people to have higher expectations for their government. I'm going to show you a clip here that is one of these approaches. And this clip focuses on kind of controlling a pair of dimensions. First, we want stories about corruption that show corruption on a smaller, more comprehensible scale for the audience, something that would be more akin to their lives, right? Graphed in the range of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, not millions, tens of millions of dollars. And second, we want examples where the corruption is met with some kind of ramification, some kind of clear indication that corruption is wrong and that it's been addressed by the society at large. So I'll play you one example here, and I think you'll see these dimensions, but also you'll see this introduces some new challenges for us at the same time. So season 2 also features a new beat. You can see if you like it better.
Corruption is not only Uganda's trouble. In countries around the world, they sometimes have it double. But many systems are able to punish for bribes with help of functional civic scrutiny and fair trials. From Charlotte, North Carolina, comes a next story of Patrick Cannon, a mayor who has fallen for glory. He was just sentenced to 4 years in prison for taking bribes worth $48,000 was the reason. He had been taking money from real estate developers, letting them acquire permits without a hassle. He was caught red-handed taking bribes from a businessman who was in fact an undercover FBI agent. The judge said he had to set an example to stop corruption from becoming rampant. Some think the best way to get rich is to become a politician, and for the companies, bribery gives them an edge of competition. The problem is the money invested in the elections. Those that sponsor the campaigns often do it in hope of future gains. In Washington and Brussels, they call it a lobby, but that with that kind of influence is a threat to democracy.
All right, so one of the obvious challenges here is just how do you make a story about a mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, interesting or relevant to people in Uganda who have never heard of Charlotte, North Carolina? It's a challenge, right? Why is this newsworthy enough to warrant coverage on the other side of the world? And it's something that you see the MC here, Lady Slake, actually struggling with. It kind of moves a little bit away from news and more towards pedantry, and that's kind of a concern. There actually was another story that just aired this week that dealt with the same problem. It was coverage of Virginia's governor, who was recently sentenced to a couple years in prison, and a separate story of a businessman in real estate in Hong Kong who ran into some trouble after trying to bribe public officials there. And the MCs, who actually do the story writing themselves, saw these two stories and said, we can't do them separately. It's just not worthy enough. So they combined them into one story, and maybe that one works a little bit more smoothly. Anyway, we're hopeful that if we are more careful and pay more attention to the content of the prime, which is basically the framing of the prime, that the stories will yield a more positive outcome or more desirable effect for us. We'll see, right? So these are airing right now. And we'll have a chance to do some follow-up research probably this spring or this summer. Thank you. So this is Survivor, Lady Slake on the right, and MC Loy. One of the interesting things here is that she's 13. So part of trying to reach out to this youthful audience in Uganda is to actually put somebody who's them on the air. And you can see actually when this first story, she's one of the MCs, and she raps with a lot more energy and sort of passion and like a little bit of a rougher edge as she's expressing herself. Thanks for your time. It's a work in progress. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Okay, questions?
Thanks, Dave.
Yes. Not a direct response. The initial motivation was actually practical. It's that realistically, people actually watch this content in group settings. You know, whether it's literally on the street outside of a kind of place of business or in one of these video halls, this is how most people are exposed. So we felt like we had to collect data in the video halls, but especially video halls are typically a male-dominated environment, and it's questionable for women to go in them at all. So we needed to collect data there, and we wanted to see what happened, but we were also aware that we wouldn't get a true representative array of the population, and we were worried that the group processes, right, that the conversation about the content would actually supersede the content itself. That the conversation would blot out what they'd actually seen, and that would really drive the effects. So the individual condition was a way of accessing a different population, of separating ourselves from group processes, and of just having a little bit more control maybe over exposure. What was the specific site that you had? This is Iyengar's. This is from 80, like not from News That Matters.
No, is anyone responsible?
Okay, is anyone responsible?
So I completely agree with you about the potential compounds of interpersonal discussion, but this may be an excellent way to determine whether there are differential gains.
Yeah.
People who are watching this versus people watching and talking about it, do they counteract that boomerang effect maybe?
So this is one of the things we definitely would like to follow up on. So this time, when we did it, we took sort of informal notes on the conversation, which is part of how we can sort of describe the state of mind people were in, because they vocalized that in the group conditions. But we didn't have a mechanism in place to really capture everything that was going on. we had a hard time actually in conducting this and controlling the number of people that participated. So in times when we thought we were going to have maybe 40 people, we ended up with like 100 people in the room. And then, you know, we're there like prepared to take notes, but it just kind of broke down some. So going forward, yeah, like if you look at Betsy Paluk, who is at Princeton, has done kind of similar work in a field setting in Rwanda and the Congo and South Sudan. And she espouses and has worked a lot to marry qualitative methods to the experimental approach. And it's been fruitful for her, so we'd like to get there.
I was just curious, just the replication, the joints that we're seeing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, thank you. Yes, please.
I had more of a conceptual question. One of the first things that I wondered, maybe I'm just not familiar with it, is how is corruption defined by different stakeholders? Like maybe Transparency International, I don't remember the research studies you were citing that were about kind of benchmarking corruption in Uganda, but what kind of like behaviors, acts, institutional policies signal corruption for those kinds of markers to be given, like this is 80% corrupt or whatever?
Yeah.
And then how is corruption, like what's the word used locally for that, or do people talk more about behaviors or like little injustices?
So actually, what constitutes corruption? The things that the Yale report found most problematic were, like, for example, international donors contribute a few $1 million to go specifically to medical supplies to address an AIDS outbreak in a part of the country. And instead of buying medical supplies, the money just disappears. Like an MP just steals it all. So those are sort of the most extreme and overt cases. Maybe $3, $5, $7 million will just disappear like that. It's more like sort of issues of nepotism, favoritism, stuff like that they also point out. How is it discussed? It's interesting, some of the, like when you're watching the news stories, they have still images that come through on a regular basis. Like one of the kind of common phrases for this is eating the money. So they actually say the same people eat the cake, and then you see visuals where there's like a man, like a big man, who's literally eating money, and this is corruption. So they're trying to sort of cue it in a way that is familiar to the audience, because, yeah, I mean, language, like, how do you convey that idea? And the approach is, I guess, somewhat more visual or more tactile than just verbal. But yeah, yes, please.
So I was thinking, well, we know from democratically restricted environments that people tend to attribute corruption to individuals rather than systematic causes, right? So I wonder if even in this newer season, if individuals are watching this and saying, oh, that mayor in Charlotte, North Carolina,
he's just
bad apple, that's too bad. And I wonder, given that we know that already, and that is a barrier to people actually fighting corruption, right? They think, oh, well, we'll get that bad guy out, maybe another guy will come in, maybe it's a bad apple too. That more cases of structural corruption, it might be an interesting condition even. Is this story framed about an individual bad apple, or is this story framed about systematic?
Sure, so episodic versus thematic, basically.
Yeah. So that maybe what the effect would be on evaluation, because your outcome is evaluating individual performance.
Yeah.
And so if you have a frame that's about individual responsibility versus systematic, I imagine there would be differences.
Yeah, this is an interesting point. I mean, of course, like all this research on attribution of responsibility specifically relates to episodic versus thematic framing. I hadn't thought about it really in this context yet. What we'd thought about was all sort of individuals, right? When you see corruption, it's an individual who then is punished. And often it's really much more complicated than that. It's a system that enables people to do things that maybe they shouldn't.
That maybe the viewer, they themselves engages in, right? Like if you live in the system, you yourself are probably paying bribes here and there.
Right.
Are you viewing your bribes and pain as part of the larger system?
Or are you just getting things done?
Yourself?
Yeah, it's a good point. We had thought about, right, so we have sort of a negative exemplar approach here with showing the people that are corrupt and then punishing them. We also have a series of segments that are being created that are on positive exemplars, basically, heroes of Africa. But again, that's still individual. It's not thematic, and a good approach, or another approach, or completely reasonable one, is to have a condition that is thematic in theme. It's a good point. I hadn't thought about it. Thank you.
Have you thought about also tying your questions about corruption to like specific aspects of corruption? And this is kind of related to Episodic, but like I've only been in Kampala for like 2 days, but I noticed the traffic is really, really bad, and in every country the traffic is really bad, and it's because of
It's getting worse.
corruption, basically.
Yeah.
Like people were blaming politicians who eat the money. So I'm wondering if that kind of a more specific.
Yeah. So this time, what we did was just take, literally just these are the questions that Iyengar and Kinder used, and we're going to map them over to here. Looking forward, it makes a lot of sense to figure out, all right, what does corruption really mean for people in Uganda? How are they speaking of it? How do they feel it? How can we then ask questions that resonate more with them? So yeah. Yes,
One
please.
exciting thing, and I don't know how this might relate to the boomerang effect. When you conducted the sessions, tell me the setup for that. Where were they? And how did people get there?
So the group sessions are done in Bibanda. Bibanda are, so like just
But sprinkled throughout.
sprinkled throughout the city.
What was in the central city?
Well, this is in Kampala.
Okay.
And Kampala
Well, Kampala's just-
is the sprawl, right?
It's a
So we
sprawl.
went out to different neighborhoods. So we're not talking about
So
downtown elite kind of Kampala. It's out in sort of the,
you did go to different.
yeah. So I think we did we did 4 group sessions in 3 locations.
Was part of the incentive at all the transportation cost?
So the recruitment was super informal here. It was basically like, here we are in this place, and we talked to the owner of the video hall and rent out the whole facility for the day. And then basically from there, word kind of spreads, something's going on there. And people came and wanted to participate. And the incentives were, it was like popcorn and or a biscuit and a Coke, basically. But that was enough to like bring people in.
One of the things I expect, did you experience a boater ride?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So the informal communication network amongst the boater rider, that's your thick channel. Were they at all part of your conversations?
So not on this project. We're looking actually, so the next data collection we're doing is around an Ebola message. And for that, because Ebola is not really an urban problem, it's a rural problem, the way we're going to do the recruitment there is we're going to go to there's basically a giant Mutatu parking lot where like all the Mutatus, the microbuses from the whole country come to this one parking lot. And we're going to that's where we're going to do all the data collection so that we get people from around the whole country that maybe are living in a more rural circumstance. So like looking forward, trying to take advantage more of that. So a lot of this was planned right before I got there. And so that was my first time. So now that I've been there a little bit, I have a little bit more of a sense of how the city works, what the people are like, how the culture functions, and it can start to integrate that more into the research. Because you're right, like there's this whole world that's like a black box that you have no idea until you're there. Yeah.
Well, go ahead, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned that more people showed up than you expected. How did you decide who to include and who to exclude?
We let everybody participate. People that came were allowed to participate. And then, like I said, we didn't want to turn people away. We were wary of creating, a scene or problems. So people that wanted to participate, they participated. And then on the back end, we used that one question of, did you understand what happened, as a filter. Yeah.
So were you concerned that the views you were getting maybe represented a particular section of population?
Yeah, right. So part of the video hall experience is that it's more of a working class audience. So this is right, an experiment random assignment. So people in both the treatment and the control condition are same population. So the difference is hopefully just attributable to the content. It's true, right? Like when you look at basic demographics, our population was a little bit older, 26 median age, average age in a place where the median age is 15 and a half. These are conducted during the day, and so people aren't necessarily at work, if they have a job, if they're doing this experiment. So the population does have some foibles, but hopefully with random assignment, this is not such an issue. Thanks. You had a follow-up?
In this gets, can media effects theory be used to inform production? I'm wondering about, you look at the second season and just the creation of the content. Within Uganda, there is a pretty sophisticated understanding of hip-hop. I mean, some of the best B-girls and B-boys in the entire world are located there.
Yeah.
And there's a real sophisticated understanding about fronted hip-hop, commercial hip-hop, and community-centric hip-hop.
Yeah.
Like the Tuka Squad and Luga Flow.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, in the context of the creation of the content, how much does the community have an impact on what content is created? Because they have a phrase, we can smell the front, which I would assume is similar to we can smell the prime, but I wouldn't necessarily make that correlation.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? It isn't like the other version is the Luca Flow version, and the English is remarkably good, and it's not their first language, right? The Luca Flow version is really, when you listen to it, they're really good. We don't write the stories, right? So there is a producer who works at PBI that sort of drives some of the story selection, like we think you should cover this, we think you should cover that. But the MCs themselves, they write the stories, and they have the ability to say, like, this doesn't belong on our show. And like I said, they did sort of refuse to cover some of these stories separately. So they have a lot of autonomy. And this actually is a challenge from like a researcher's perspective, because I don't really have like meticulous authority over exactly the script or the delivery, at all, and the beat, right? So these are stories about corruption that are delivered in sort of an up-tempo, positive way. So the affect is completely out of my control. But it's like this process, right? Part of the idea of NGO-led public diplomacy is that it isn't somebody sitting in Washington, D.C., going through 8 layers of bureaucracy and signing off on something. It's something that's created there by people that are on the ground, and so it does have more of a feeling of authenticity and a higher chance of resonating with the audience, even if there are some concessions made to, the external funder in this case. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, just that experience those folks are seeing it outside. I mean, I know you're studying them within these video halls, but outside of that, how are they experiencing it?
This is a good question, right? And
that's outside of the scope, obviously.
Well, I mean, really thinking about like the work with PVI more broadly, like the ultimate scope is to try and figure out ways to assess not just that like a video disc is being distributed to a video hall in this location once a week, but who's seeing it and what's it doing. And that means being able to conceptualize a way to capture a response to some of those questions. So that is part of like the big picture for us. It's hard. I mean, like there's no Nielsen in in Uganda.
There is. It's the Boda Riders.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you can connect them.
Yeah. Yeah, Matt.
Just a basic question. What makes PBI want to go into this third branch of research and understanding? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So what's the motivation?
What's driving them?
I mean, I think there's 2 things. One, the guy that runs PBI has like a communication background. He's not really an empirical researcher, but he values the academy, so he has that interest. And 2, funders want to see impact. They want to say, like, we gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to this. What happened? And so for this to be, so PBI is 4 years old now, and over that period of time, maybe they've had sort of a cumulative funding of approaching $2 million. But to be sustainable going forward, there's like a sort of a so what question. And so what usually means randomized control trials. So,
Interesting.
yeah. Yeah, please.
Where's PBI based?
Brooklyn, Bushwick, but Bushwick and Kampala. It's a small, so they're,
Just peripheral Bushwick.
yeah, right. I think they were talking about changing the name because they started to feel like, I think the idea was that it wasn't it was a pun. It was peripheral as in like developing world, but also it was something that was out of the periphery of your vision, right? So it was something that was happening that you weren't totally aware of. And now it's sort of like, well, maybe I've outgrown that name. The director and one employee work in Brooklyn, but the director spends half his year in Kampala, and actually the other employee spends half her year in Tanzania. And then in Kampala, they have, so I think they have, as of this month, they'll have 8 full-time, like kind of enumerator distributor employees, and then a couple other staff members that are sort of producing and content development, stuff like that. Yeah. Thank you.